Part 1. Hello everyone tonight. We're going to slip into one of those stories that feels like the opening scene of a thriller, except it's not a movie, it really happened. Picture this: the cold, damp pre-dawn air over Long Island, the narrow lanes winding through Oak Beach, and a young woman's voice cutting through the silence. Not soft, not calm, but frantic. She's on the phone with 911, and what she says is chilling. Someone's after her. A murder mystery has occurred. Now, before we let the shadows swallow us whole, a little housekeeping. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And hey, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what you do during the day. Who knows, you might find out someone else in the comments lives just a few blocks away. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The call came in at 4:51 a.m. on May 1st, 2010. Shannan Gilbert, a 23-year-old woman who'd been working as an escort, told the 911 operator in a terrified voice, "They're trying to kill me." The recording, which wouldn't be released publicly until years later, stretches on for over 20 minutes. That's not normal. Usually distressed calls cut out or are ended quickly. Shannan stayed on the line, her panic spilling into the darkness while dispatchers scrambled to make sense of it. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether she truly believed someone was chasing her or if it was a mixture of fear, confusion, and the influence of substances. What's undeniable is that Shannan was running for her life through Oak Beach, a secluded, somewhat eerie community along the barrier islands of Long Island's South Shore. Let's pause on Oak Beach for a moment. It's not the kind of neighborhood where people expect drama. Retirees, fishermen, people who know each other's business, quiet cul-de-sacs lined with modest homes. Yet here was Shannan, a stranger, racing down their streets, knocking on doors and screaming for help. The unusual detail: several residents actually did open their doors that night. Some saw her disoriented, barefoot, banging on windows. One even called the police, describing a young woman who seemed lost and terrified. But she didn't stay at any of those doors. She kept running deeper into the maze. Her driver, Michael Pock, later said he was confused and helpless. He claimed Shannan had suddenly lost it bolting from the car after visiting her client, Joseph Brewer, in his home. Brewer himself insisted he had done nothing wrong, that he had simply hired Shannan for company, and when she began acting strangely, he asked her to leave. It was just another Saturday night for him, he told reporters, until everything went sideways. Imagine the scene: like a camera slowly pulling back. A dim streetlight, flickering shadows stretching long, the muffled sound of waves crashing nearby. And then a young woman's figure, hair wild, arms waving, voice hoarse from screaming, disappearing into the marshland. No one knew it yet, but this was the last confirmed time anyone saw Shannan alive. This is where that creeping unease begins. The call is logged. The neighbors' reports are filed. A driver waits in his car, unsure whether to chase after her or respect her panic. And out in the marshes, black water reeds whispering in the wind, something irreversible unfolds. Years later, police would finally release the 911 tape. Hearing it is like being pulled back into that night. You can sense the adrenaline in Shannan's words, the desperation to be believed. And you can hear the operator struggling to calm her, asking for an address, asking her to stay put. But she keeps moving, always moving. Some people argue that what happened next was tragically simple, that Shannan ran into the marsh, became disoriented, and drowned in shallow water. Others argue the opposite, that someone chased her, silenced her, and left her body hidden for months. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was a straightforward accident or the opening act of something far darker. What's clear is this: in those early morning hours, a missing person case was born. Not just any case, but one that would eventually unravel into one of the most disturbing crime stories in modern American history. Shannan Gilbert didn't just vanish. Her disappearance would lead police to the remains of multiple other women buried along Ocean Parkway. And the phrase "Long Island serial killer" would enter the public imagination. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, we're still in those tense minutes. Shannan's phone line goes dead. Neighbors shake their heads uneasy. Pock drives away, claiming he couldn't find her. Brewer closes his door, probably locking it a little tighter than usual. And Oak Beach, once quiet, is left haunted by the echo of footsteps fading into the reeds. Shannan Gilbert wasn't a stranger to struggle. By the time she found herself on that lonely road in Oak Beach, she had already lived through a life that pulled her in two directions, toward dreams of stability and music, and toward the harsh realities of Bill's survival and an underground trade that often swallows young women whole. Tonight, let's look closely at who she was. Not just the missing woman on the 9/11 tape, but the sister, the daughter, the dreamer, and yes, the escort who walked into a job that would prove fatal. She was born in 1986, raised in a family that was far from picture perfect. Her mother, Mari Gilbert, was tough, the kind of woman hardened by responsibility. There were multiple children in the house, and Mari didn't have the luxury of being soft. Shannan grew up fast. Her siblings remembered her as smart but restless, someone who wanted more than what was around her. At one point, she even dreamed of becoming a singer. It sounds almost cliché, the young girl with a notebook full of lyrics, believing that one day she'd break out of a rough childhood and step into the light. And here's the strange detail that sticks out: Shannan did record some music. Amateur tracks, scratchy recordings, not professional by any means, but proof she had that spark of ambition. Somewhere on a hard drive or tucked into an old CD, you can hear her voice chasing that dream. Yet life wasn't going to roll out a red carpet. She dropped out of high school, bounced between homes, and by her early 20s, she was working as an escort. Now we should pause here. Escort work sits in this gray zone. It's not always legal, but it's not always criminal in spirit either. For some, it's a choice. For others, it's desperation. For Shannan, it was complicated. She wanted independence money to live on her own and a way to fund her bigger ambitions. Escorting provided quick cash, but it also pulled her into a dangerous world where anonymity is currency and predators are common. Her mother, Mari, disapproved. The siblings had mixed feelings, but they all loved her, even if they couldn't keep her from drifting down that risky path. And that's what makes this a sibling mystery, too. Shannan wasn't just another victim. She was someone's sister, someone's anchor in a family that already felt the weight of poverty and hardship. One night before her disappearance, she spoke with one of her sisters, Cher. They talked about ordinary things, but there was an undertone of distance. Shannan often kept parts of her life hidden from them, who she was seeing where she was working. Yet at the same time, she longed for connection. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether her choice to go to Oak Beach was purely business, or if there was some deeper need for validation or for escaping the city noise for a night by the ocean. And here's something eerie: Shannan was reportedly afraid of water. Not terrified, but uneasy. She wasn't a swimmer. She didn't like the idea of being near deep marshes or the Atlantic stretching endlessly in the dark. Remember that, because it will come back to us later like a haunting chord in a song. Her escort work wasn't solo either. She often worked with Michael Pock, her driver. He wasn't a pimp in the traditional sense, but more of a protection and transportation figure. He would drive her to clients, wait outside, and take a cut of her earnings. That arrangement sounds protective, but it also placed her in a strange dependency. If Pac decided to leave, she was stranded. If he didn't step in during danger, she was vulnerable. And in Oak Beach, that dependency would turn into a chasm of unanswered questions. Meanwhile, Mari often clashed with Shannan. They argued about her choices. Mari wanted her to quit escorting, settle into something safer, maybe go back to school. Shannan, on the other hand, was stubborn. She believed she was in control of her path. In fact, one of her sisters later described her as fiercely independent, sometimes to the point of being reckless. Still, family ties ran deep. Shannan wasn't estranged. She came home for visits, called when she could. There are snapshots of her laughing with her sisters, arms linked, pretending for a moment that life wasn't as complicated as it really was. These are the little pieces of her humanity that often get lost when people reduce her to escort missing on Long Island. This dual life, ambitious young woman versus vulnerable escort, would collide in Oak Beach. She wasn't just there as a worker on a job. She carried her entire history with her: the childhood that made her tough, the dreams that kept her going, the family that worried constantly, and the fragile independence she fought for. That's what makes the story so devastating. She wasn't a statistic. She was a full human being pulled into the shadows because of choices she made in a world that punishes vulnerability. Now put yourself in the shoes of her siblings. You're watching the news, hearing the whispers, escort vanished after seeing a client. And suddenly your sister is no longer just your sister, she's a headline. The media doesn't soften things. They rarely call her an aspiring singer or a young woman trying to support herself. No, they call her an escort, as if that word defines everything, and you're left fighting to remind the world she was more than that. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether her background played a role in the way her case was handled. Did the police respond as urgently as they would have if Shannan had been, say, a college student from a wealthy suburb? Mari believed the answer was no. She accused law enforcement of dragging their feet, of not taking her daughter's disappearance seriously because of her job. And it's hard not to see some truth in that accusation when we trace how the search unfolded. So here we are. The night of May 1st wasn't just a random tragedy, it was the collision point of Shannan's entire life. The childhood hardships, the dreams left unfinished, the family dynamics, and the dangerous balance of escort work. She stepped into Oak Beach as one person carrying all those contradictions, and by morning she was gone. When we pick up the threads of Shannan's last night, we can't ignore the two men who anchored the scene, her client Joseph Brewer and her driver Michael Pack. These names became etched into the case almost immediately, and for good reason. Each man told a story, and those stories didn't quite fit together. Brewer was in his mid-40s, divorced, living in the quiet community of Oak Beach. By his account, he was just another man looking for company. He hired escorts, occasionally, nothing unusual in his eyes. On the night of May 1st, 2010, he placed a call. Shannan arrived with Pac driving, and everything was meant to follow the script of countless other encounters. Except it didn't. Brewer later said Shannan appeared nervous, off, not relaxed. Some reports suggested she smoked marijuana in his home. Others whispered about possible prescription drugs. Brewer swore there was no heavy drinking, no hard drugs, nothing beyond a few uneasy exchanges. Then, sometime after 4 a.m., things spiraled. According to Brewer, Shannan began acting paranoid, insisting that someone was after her. She accused Brewer of trying to harm her, which he denied. He told investigators he tried to calm her down, that he repeatedly said, "Nobody's after you. You're safe here." But her panic only escalated. At one point, he claimed she ran into the street screaming, which matches what some neighbors later described. Pac, waiting outside, had his own version. He said Brewer called him into the house when Shannan started losing it. Pac entered, tried to coax her out, but Shannan resisted. Instead, she grew more agitated, telling him he was part of some plot against her. Imagine that your driver, the person meant to keep you safe, suddenly framed in your mind as the enemy. That's paranoia at full tilt. Here's the unusual detail that chills me. Shannan had a working cell phone and used it. That 911 call lasted over 20 minutes. During parts of it, you can hear her repeating that someone was after her. At times, Pac's and Brewer's voices are faintly audible. It's a rare, eerie overlap, two men insisting everything was fine, and a woman insisting the opposite, her voice cracking with fear. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was the result of substances interacting badly with Shannan's body, or whether something far darker had actually triggered her terror. Some toxicology reports later hinted at potential drug use, though not enough to explain a full psychotic episode. And even if it had been drug-induced, the question lingers: why did she feel hunted? Why did she single out both men as potential threats? Pac said he tried to get her back into the car, but she refused. He followed her as she bolted down the street, begging her to come with him. At one point, according to his account, she hid behind a boat trailer, crouching in the shadows, convinced someone was chasing her. Pac swore no one else was there, but Shannan refused to believe him. Meanwhile, Brewer, disturbed by the whole scene, insisted he had nothing to do with her disappearance. He didn't chase her. He didn't touch her. He simply locked his door once she ran outside. To this day, Brewer maintains his innocence. This is where the story tightens like a noose. On one hand, you've got two men whose stories line up just enough to sound believable. On the other, you've got a young woman's raw, recorded panic telling us something was very wrong. Which version do you trust? And there's another layer. Pac eventually gave up. He waited in his car, then drove off without her. That fact sticks in the throat. The man who was supposed to protect her, to make sure she got home, just left. To him, she wasn't a lost child in need of saving. She was a client. If she wasn't cooperating, she wasn't his problem. And so as dawn crept closer, he turned the key in the ignition and left her behind in the marshlands. That decision is one of the most haunting pivot points in this entire mystery. If he had insisted, if he had called the police immediately, if he had refused to leave without her, maybe Shannan's story would have ended differently. But we'll never know. Brewer, Pak, and Shannan, three figures in a triangle of tension. One calling the police, one shrugging it off, and one running for her life. The contradictions between their accounts still fuel debate today. Did Brewer truly do nothing? Did Pak abandon her when she most needed him? Or was Shannan's fear rooted in something unseen, someone who slipped away before anyone else noticed? The camera in your mind should be shifting now, zooming between those three perspectives. Brewer closing his door, Pak sitting in his car engine idling, and Shannan barefoot tearing across damp pavement, convinced death was only a step behind. And remember, throughout all of this, her phone line with 911 stayed open. Somewhere in the background of that call, all of this was playing out in real time. The dispatcher couldn't see it. We can't see it. But the echo of her fear lingers like a ghost, filling in the gaps where hard evidence still refuses to appear. The community of Oak Beach at first glance hardly looks like the kind of place where a crime thriller would unfold. It's a gated neighborhood tucked against the barrier islands of Long Island, a sleepy cluster of homes that share a single winding road in and out. By day, it's quiet, breezy, with water shimmering nearby and gulls swooping over the docks. But by night, especially in the small hours before dawn, it's isolated, few streetlights, long shadows, that sense that if you scream, only the marshes will answer. And into this maze ran Shannan Gilbert. The 911 operator kept asking where she was, but Oak Beach is tricky even for residents. It isn't a grid, it's more like a loop with small side roads. For someone panicked, disoriented, and unfamiliar with the layout, it's the worst possible place to run. Neighbors recall pieces of her desperate dash. There's the detail of Shannan pounding on the door of Gus Coletti, one of the residents, begging for help. Coletti, a retired insurance fraud investigator, opened his door and tried to calm her down. He said she was terrified, incoherent, repeating that they're trying to kill me. He urged her to come inside to wait while he called the police, but she refused. To Coletti, it seemed as if she didn't trust anyone, not even him, and just like that she bolted again, disappearing into the night. Another neighbor, Barbara Brennan, later told police she saw a young woman running past barefoot and frantic. Brennan thought it was odd, but not quite enough to chase after her. Imagine the unsettling scene in your safe suburban enclave. Someone races by screaming in the dark. Do you open your door? Do you stay inside in Oak Beach? Most people stayed behind their locks, peeking from curtains, hoping it wasn't as bad as it sounded. Meanwhile, Michael Pak said he followed her in his car, headlights sweeping across the cul-de-sacs as he tried to spot her. At one point, he claimed she darted out from behind a bush, then vanished again. Eventually, he gave up, telling himself she would come back when she cooled down, and so he drove off, leaving her to the elements. Here's the unusual detail: Shannan wasn't dressed for the marsh. She wore casual clothes, not outdoor gear. No jacket, no flashlight, no shoes by the end of her sprint. The marshlands bordering Oak Beach are unforgiving mud reeds taller than your head, and in May temperatures that dip low enough to make hypothermia a real threat. For a woman already terrified and possibly impaired, it was like stepping into a labyrinth designed to swallow her whole. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether anyone actually chased her that night. Brewer swore he stayed in his house. Pak swore he wasn't involved. Neighbors didn't see anyone else, yet Shannan's voice on the 911 call insists otherwise. She kept repeating that someone was pursuing her. Was it a delusion? Was it the marsh itself, the rustle of reeds, the trickle of water that amplified her paranoia? Or was there truly another figure in the darkness, never identified, never questioned? The geography of Oak Beach is important here. Beyond the homes lies the marsh, and beyond the marsh, the Great South Bay. There's no straight line out. If you wander too far, you either loop back to the same road, or you end up in knee-deep mud with water sucking at your legs. For locals, it's a nuisance. For a terrified outsider, it's a death trap. Coletti, unsettled by what he saw, did call the police. But by the time they arrived, Shannan was gone. The streets were quiet again, the marsh whispering as if nothing had happened. The officers did a quick sweep, saw no immediate threat, and left. To them, it may have looked like a domestic disturbance, maybe a sex worker gone hysterical. What they didn't realize was that a missing person case had just been born, one that would not only shake Oak Beach, but unravel into one of America's most notorious mysteries. Let's zoom out for a moment. Imagine Oak Beach from above. In those early hours, houses like tiny square streetlights dim a car idling, and then leaving a handful of neighbors peeking through blinds, and one woman barefoot weaving between yards. A cinematic image if there ever was one, except in this film, the final scene is unwritten. We can't escape the chilling fact that Oak Beach's maze isn't just geographical, it's metaphorical too. The case itself becomes a maze, winding stories, dead-ends theories that circle back on themselves. And at the center of it all is Shannan, lost both literally and symbolically. Her last confirmed sighting is etched in memory, Coletti's doorstep. After that, she slipped into the marsh. Whether she went willingly out of fear or whether she was forced, we still don't know. And the marsh, silent as it seemed, would hold its secret for months before giving any piece of her back. But in those hours, as the first threads of daylight touched the bay, Oak Beach returned to its quiet routine. Fishermen prepped boats, residents shook their heads over the strange night, and the Suffolk County Police filed away one more call, unaware or maybe unwilling to believe that a larger storm was brewing beneath the reeds. By the time Shannan's figure slipped from sight, she was no longer just a frightened visitor to Oak Beach. She had become a ghost in motion, darting between the houses before vanishing into the black belly of the marsh. The last echoes of her screams faded, and with them, the final concrete thread anyone could hold on to. The marshland that borders Oak Beach is not forgiving terrain. It's a patchwork of reeds, mud, shallow pools, and brackish water that seems to breathe on its own. By day, you might call it serene, a place where herons stalk fish and salt air lingers. But at night, it is disorienting, treacherous, and alive with sounds that make even the bravest turn back. The marsh swallows light, muffles footsteps, and hides whatever dares to step inside. Michael Pock later described one last glimpse: Shannan running toward the bay, ignoring his pleas to get back in the car. He said she wouldn't listen, her eyes wide, her body jerking with adrenaline. He claimed he lost sight of her at the edge of the reeds, the stalks parting as if she had walked into another world. He waited a while, then left. That detail has always hung heavy. He left. Whether out of fear, frustration, or simply cold detachment, he turned away. Neighbors who had seen her earlier returned to bed, convinced the police would sort it out. The dispatcher who had stayed on the line with her hung up when the call finally dropped. In the silence that followed, Shannan was alone. Here's a strange, unsettling fact: the marsh where she vanished was only a few hundred yards wide before it met the bay. If she had kept running straight, she might have reached open water. If she had turned left, she would have circled back to the main road, and yet she was never seen alive again. It's as though the marsh itself pulled her under and refused to give her back. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether she stumbled into one of the pools, became trapped in the mud and drowned, or whether something or someone intervened. Skeptics argue that a young woman, barefoot and panicked, could easily lose her bearings, collapse in exhaustion, and die within minutes. But others point to the sheer persistence in her voice during that 23-minute 911 call. She wasn't wandering aimlessly. She believed she was being pursued. Who then was chasing her into the reeds? The Suffolk County Police conducted only a cursory search that first day. No dogs, no helicopters, no floodlights sweeping over the marsh. They treated it as though she had simply run off, perhaps resurfacing later. After all, she was just an escort, a label that unfairly carried its own dismissals. The urgency wasn't there. That delay would haunt the case for years. Meanwhile, Mari Gilbert, waking to the news that her daughter was missing, began her descent into a nightmare. But we'll come back to her in a moment. For now, let's stay in the marsh where the silence was deceptive. What makes this part of the story cinematic is the contrast. Imagine it, Shannan, running full tilt into an alien landscape, her breath ragged, her clothes catching on reeds, water splashing at her ankles. Above her, the stars dim as the horizon begins to glow with the first hint of dawn. The houses behind her return to their stillness, and then nothing. A cut to black. The marsh itself became an open wound for Oak Beach. In the days that followed, residents whispered about the girl who had come screaming through their streets and then dissolved into the wetlands. Some said they heard her cries long after phantom echoes carried by the wind. Others swore they saw shadows moving at night too tall to be reeds. Whether those were real memories or the byproduct of guilt, we'll never know. And here's the odd detail: Shannan wasn't the first to disappear in that region, though she was the first to do it so dramatically. Over the decades, the beaches and parkways of Long Island had been a dumping ground for more than one predator. Police files hinted at unsolved cases, bodies found in shallow graves, missing women whose last known connections were to the same industry Shannan worked in. When she ran into the marsh that night, she may have unknowingly stepped onto ground already haunted by ghosts of others before her. For months, her body would not be found. For months, the marsh would hold its silence, letting theories multiply in the vacuum. Did she drown within yards of safety? Did someone drag her deeper into the reeds? Or did the water itself, black and endless, become her final grave? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Shannan's death was accidental or orchestrated, but one truth is clear: her disappearance didn't vanish into obscurity. Instead, it cracked open a case so large, so grotesque, that Oak Beach's marsh would become the epicenter of a serial killer investigation. But that discovery was still far off. In May of 2010, all that remained was the sound of crickets, the smell of salt in the air, and the image of a young woman's figure swallowed by the reeds, never to emerge. Back in Jersey City, while the marsh in Oak Beach grew quiet again, the Gilbert household erupted into panic. When the call came that Shannan had gone missing, her mother, Mari, felt the floor vanish beneath her. It wasn't the kind of phone call a parent expects, but it also wasn't the kind she could brush off. Shannan was gone, her last contact, a cryptic, terrified plea to 911. Mari wasn't the type to wait patiently for answers. She'd raised 4 daughters, often on her own, and had weathered poverty, conflict, and all the weight that comes with trying to hold a family together by sheer force of will. To her, Shannan wasn't just another child. She was the oldest, the trailblazer, the one who had always dreamed bigger than the rest. For Marie, the thought that her daughter had simply wandered off was laughable. Something bad had happened, and she wanted answers immediately. Her other daughters, Cher, Sarah, and Stevie, felt the blow in different ways. Cher, the most outspoken, would later say that when she first heard Shannan was missing, she thought it was a mistake. Shannan was the independent one, the fighter. If anyone could take care of herself, it was her. But as the hours turned into days with no word, the denial cracked and dread set in. Here's the unusual detail that struck them all. Shannan had never gone this long without checking in. No matter where she was or who she was with, she called. If not her mother, then one of her sisters. Even when things were rough, even when she was secretive, there was always some kind of breadcrumb. This time, nothing. Silence. Mari drove out to Long Island almost immediately, marching into the Oak Beach community as if she could pull Shannan back by sheer determination. Neighbors remembered her, this sharp-eyed woman, demanding to know what they saw, who they spoke to, why nobody had helped. She went to Brewer's house, looked him dead in the eye, and told him she didn't believe his story. She questioned Pak too, accusing him of abandoning her daughter. For Mari, neither man's version added up. And let's be clear, Mari was right to question. Both men had reasons to protect themselves. Brewer didn't want to be painted as the villain who harmed a woman he hired for company. Pak didn't want to be seen as negligent or complicit. Their testimonies overlapped just enough to provide a narrative, but the holes were obvious. Mari could smell it. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether law enforcement's initial response was influenced by Shannan's occupation. Mari believed it was. She accused the police of dragging their feet, not treating her disappearance with the urgency it deserved. To her, it felt like they dismissed Shannan as just another escort who made bad choices. That sting never left Mari's tongue. Meanwhile, the media began circling. Headlines framed Shannan as a missing call girl, her name tied tightly to her work. Mari fought hard against that image, reminding reporters that her daughter was more than a label, that she was a sister, a dreamer, and a woman worth looking for. Sherry and Stevie joined that fight, speaking to journalists, pleading for attention, trying to remind the world that Shannan was a whole person, not a footnote. And then there was Sarah, the middle daughter, who struggled most under the weight. Sarah had her own battles with mental illness, and Mari's focus on Shannan sometimes deepened the cracks between them. The irony is sharp. While Mari searched endlessly for one daughter, another daughter's life, began spiraling in a direction just as tragic. But in 2010, no one could predict how entangled those threads would become. What's most striking when you picture the Gilbert family in those first weeks is the energy of raw, chaotic love. They didn't have polished statements. They weren't wealthy. They didn't have lawyers or PR people smoothing their image. They had only their voices shaky with grief and their relentless mother leading the charge like a soldier in battle. In the evenings, Mari would sit with Shannan's siblings replaying what little they knew. The 911 call the fragments from neighbors the accounts of Pac and Brewer. Each time she grew more convinced her daughter had been silenced by foul play. She didn't just disappear, Mari told anyone who would listen. Somebody did this. And here's the eerie part, Mari wasn't entirely wrong. While the marsh held Shannan's body out of sight, it was also hiding something much bigger. Bodies of other women who, like Shannan, had been escorts discarded along the parkway as if they were nothing. Shannan's disappearance had cracked open a doorway into a nightmare none of them yet understood. But for Mari and her daughters, May of 2010 wasn't about serial killers or headlines. It was about the raw ache of absence. A missing voice at the dinner table, a phone that never rang, a sister who never came home. The Gilbert house was filled with tension, sleep-lost arguments sparked by grief, the quiet sobs of sisters trying to stay strong. Yet beneath it all, there was a stubborn flame of hope. Mari believed she would find her daughter. Alive, dead, lost, or hiding, she was determined to bring her back. And that fire would keep her marching forward even when the truth grew darker than she ever imagined. As the weeks stretched into months, the disappearance of Shannan Gilbert began to drift toward that dangerous place where unsolved cases go, the shadows of public forgetfulness. The police had moved on to other priorities. Oak Beach residents had returned to their routines, and the summer season rolled across Long Island like nothing had ever happened. But Mari Gilbert didn't let the silence swallow her daughter's name. She called detectives daily, demanding updates. She knocked on the doors of reporters. She rallied her other daughters, reminding them, if we don't keep saying her name, no one will. That persistence became the engine that kept the case alive, even as investigators seemed content to file it under missing. And then came the dog walker. On a cold December day in 2010, 7 months after Shannan had disappeared, a police officer was out training his German Shepherd along Ocean Parkway just a few miles from Oak Beach. The officer wasn't looking for Shannan. He was practicing routine search techniques, letting the dog sniff along the brush. But suddenly the shepherd froze, barked, and pulled toward the tangled weeds that lined the road. What they found was a set of human remains, wrapped, bound, left in the undergrowth like discarded trash. Not Shannan, but another woman. A Jane Doe, at least for the moment. The discovery triggered a new wave of searching along Ocean Parkway. It was the kind of search Shannan never received in those early days. Helicopters circling overhead, forensic teams combing through sand and brush, cadaver dogs leading officers deeper and deeper into the landscape. And in the days that followed, the bodies began to multiply. One by one they appeared. In total, 4 sets of remains were uncovered in that first sweep. Women, young, petite, many working as escorts just like Shannan. Their disappearances had been quiet, unconnected, and ignored until now. Here's the chilling, unusual detail. All 4 had been wrapped in burlap, the kind used in gardening or construction. Burlap isn't just a material. It carries a texture, a smell, a deliberate choice. Whoever left those women there had a signature, and signatures in criminal investigations usually point to serial killers. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether these first 4 bodies were left by the same hand or whether multiple predators used Ocean Parkway as their dumping ground. The similarities suggested a single killer, but the years to come would complicate that neat picture. The media exploded. Headlines branded the unknown perpetrator the Long Island serial killer, or LISK for short. News trucks parked along the highways. Reporters speculated about whether Shannan was the 5th victim lost deeper in the marsh. The case transformed overnight from one woman's mysterious disappearance to a sprawling serial murder investigation. Mari Gilbert, though devastated, found herself in a grim paradox. On one hand, the discovery of these other women meant her daughter's case wasn't isolated. Shannan's disappearance was part of something bigger, something terrifying. On the other hand, Shannan still hadn't been found. Her name was dragged along in every article, but her body was not among those recovered. She remained the ghost at the center of the storm. For Oak Beach residents, the horror of those days was like a film playing out in slow motion. Suddenly, they were the backdrop for a serial killer hunt. Helicopters thudded overhead. News crews swarmed the neighborhood, strangers parked along their streets, snapping photos of their once quiet community. Some residents felt guilt they had heard Shannan's cries but done little. Others resented Mari, accusing her of dragging their neighborhood into chaos. And here's a quiet, almost cinematic moment worth holding on to. Imagine Mari standing at the edge of Ocean Parkway, the winter wind whipping her hair, watching officers carry out bags of evidence. She must have thought, my daughter is out here somewhere. I can feel it. The bodies of other women may have been unearthed, but for Mari, the marsh was still holding Shannan hostage. That December discovery changed everything. It was no longer just the Gilbert family shouting into the void. It was a national story, a full-blown hunt for a serial predator. And Shannan Gilbert, even in her absence, had become the key that unlocked it all. By spring of 2011, the investigation along Ocean Parkway had grown into one of the largest searches in Long Island history. Police widened their perimeter, digging through sand dunes, brush, and tangled weeds with the help of cadaver dogs and forensic teams. What started as 4 bodies quickly grew into a macabre discovery zone. Over the next few months, remains kept surfacing. First partial skeletal fragments, then whole bodies, each one left carelessly but deliberately near the same stretch of road. By the time the tally was finished, the number had doubled: 10 sets of remains in total. 10 lives extinguished and discarded in the same haunting landscape. And still, none of them belonged to Shannan. Here's the chilling fact that stunned both investigators and the public: not all the victims were recent. Some remains had been there for years, long before Shannan's desperate dash through Oak Beach. Forensic analysis showed that the earliest victims dated back to the late 1990s. That meant whoever was responsible had been hunting, killing, and discarding victims for more than a decade, completely undetected. The victims shared unsettling similarities. Many were young women, petite, and worked as escorts, often using Craigslist or other online platforms to find clients. But in between them, investigators found something that made the case even stranger. Among the 10 were not just women, but also a toddler, unidentified, left in a bag, and an Asian male dressed in women's clothing. These details disrupted the neat profile investigators were trying to build. If it was one killer, his choices were far less predictable than most serial predators. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether all 10 victims were linked to the same hand. Some argued it was the work of multiple killers who happened to use the same dumping ground. Others believed the diversity of victims pointed to a single, highly erratic predator. To this day, that debate hasn't been resolved. For Mari Gilbert, the discoveries were both devastating and galvanizing. Every time another body was found, she was torn between dread and hope. Dread that it might finally be Shannan, and hope that if it wasn't, maybe Shannan was still alive. But by the time the 10th set of remains was uncovered, Mari began to realize the truth: Shannan, too, was likely out there waiting to be found. The media frenzy intensified. The phrase Long Island serial killer became a household term. Talk shows debated whether Shannan was victim number 11. Documentaries began filming, sketching eerie montages of wind-blown marshes and empty highways. The Gilberts, once just another struggling family, were thrust into the spotlight, their grief broadcast for the nation. But through all of it, the key detail remained: Shannan's 911 call. 23 minutes of fear. 23 minutes of insisting she was being pursued. Her disappearance had not been quiet. It had been loud, chaotic, witnessed. And yet she was the one still missing. For Mari, that gap was unacceptable. Here's an unusual image worth remembering. During one of the searches, officers reported finding pieces of clothing tangled in the reed shoes fabric, even a handbag. None of it belonged definitively to Shannan. Still, every scrap was bagged and tested. Imagine the cruel suspense of each phone call to Mari telling her it wasn't her daughter's. Relief and agony colliding. As weeks became months, Oak Beach transformed from a sleepy private community into a symbol of hidden horror. Police checkpoints lined the parkway, neighbors whispered about the killer possibly living among them, and amateur sleuths swarmed online forums with theories. Some pointed fingers at Brewer, others at Pac. Still others believed a local police officer might be involved. The speculation was endless, and the truth buried in the marsh remained elusive. Through it all, Mari's resolve hardened. She knew one thing: she would not stop until her daughter was found. The summer of 2011 carried with it a strange duality. On one hand, Ocean Parkway had become the most scrutinized strip of land in New York, crawling with investigators, journalists, and camera crews. On the other, Shannan Gilbert herself seemed to slip further and further into the background of her own disappearance. 10 bodies had been pulled from the brush, each story unfolding with tragic detail, yet Shannan's name was spoken more often as a possible 11th than as the terrified young woman whose cries had first cracked open this case. Mari Gilbert refused to let her daughter be a footnote. She pushed herself into every interview, every press conference, reminding the world this all started because of Shannan. She insisted that her daughter's disappearance was not just coincidence, not just a young woman lost in the marsh. Mari knew deep in her bones that the men Shannan had encountered that night, Brewer, Pock, and maybe others, were the key to understanding what had really happened. And here's a legitimate historical fact worth noting: despite the enormous search operation, the Suffolk County Police Department was under immense criticism for how the case was handled. The department had faced scandals in the past, including corruption and cover-ups, which fueled rumors that someone in law enforcement might have had ties to the case. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether bias against sex workers led officers to dismiss Shannan's disappearance too quickly, effectively letting crucial evidence slip through their fingers. Meanwhile, Marie wasn't the only one chasing answers. Journalists dug into the backgrounds of Oak Beach residents. Online sleuths published maps plotting where each body had been found. Theories blossomed like weeds. Some believed the Long Island serial killer lived right there in Oak Beach, able to slip victims into the marsh under cover of night. Others pointed to truck drivers or fishermen who knew the parkway intimately. A darker corner of speculation wondered whether Shannan had stumbled onto the killer in action that night, and her frantic 911 call was the result of witnessing something she shouldn't have. Here's the unusual detail that kept people hooked: the 911 call itself remained sealed. Aside from law enforcement, nobody had heard all 23 minutes of it. What exactly Shannan said, what names she might have spoken, what threats she might have described was locked away. Only snippets emerged, whispered secondhand through leaks or court filings, enough to keep the public gnawing at theories, but never enough to draw conclusions. While the world spun with speculation, the Gilbert family carried the weight of absence in more personal ways. Sherry, the sister closest to Shannan in age, became Mari's fiercest ally, appearing in interviews pushing for more searches. Stevie, the youngest, tried to hold on to the memory of her sister without being crushed by the constant spotlight. And Sarah, the daughter already fragile from mental illness, began to unravel under the strain her relationship with Mari fraying, as the obsession with Shannan consumed their family life. But Mari pressed on. She returned to Oak Beach repeatedly, standing by the marsh as though sheer proximity could draw her daughter back. She confronted residents, questioned police, demanded justice. Her presence was not always welcome. Oak Beach was a gated community, and residents complained about the circus that had descended on their quiet enclave. Mari didn't care. Her daughter had disappeared here. If the truth lay behind one of those locked doors, she intended to find it. By late 2011, the investigation had reached a frustrating plateau. No arrests, no suspects, just an expanding list of victims and a tangle of theories. The public's fascination began to wane, but Marie's determination only sharpened. She began working with lawyers, pushing to have the full 911 call released, certain it held the answer. And here's the haunting thought: while investigators combed the dunes and theorists mapped the parkway, Shannan's body was still there, lying in the marsh less than half a mile from where she had vanished, hidden in plain sight. The land had kept her secret all this time, refusing to give her back until it was ready. The story was far from over. By December of 2011, the marsh that had swallowed Shannan Gilbert finally began to speak. After a year and a half of questions, searches, and theories, investigators returned once more to Oak Beach. This time, they came with a focus sharpened by Mari's relentless pressure. The cadaver dogs were released into the reeds again, and before long, the silence cracked. Pieces of human remains were found. First, a set of clothing waterlogged and frayed jeans, shoes, and a pocketbook that matched what Shannan had been wearing the night she vanished. Then came skeletal fragments scattered through the thick brush bones that had been lying there for months untouched by anyone but the elements. Finally, a jawbone with teeth intact enough for dental records to confirm the truth Mari had dreaded, yet long suspected Shannan Gilbert was dead. The announcement cut through the winter air like a blade. For Mari, it was the end of hope, but not the end of the fight. She collapsed at first, yes, but then she stood again, fueled by an even stronger conviction Shannan had not died by accident. Here's a legitimate historical fact. Police immediately ruled her death as a likely drowning. Their narrative was that Shannan, disoriented and frightened, had fled into the marsh, become trapped in the muddy pools, and succumbed to exhaustion and cold. To them, it was a tragic accident, not murder. But Mari and her daughters refused to accept this explanation. Shannan's final words on the 911 call echoed too loudly in their minds. "They're trying to kill me." That wasn't the voice of someone merely confused. That was the voice of someone convinced her life was in danger. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Shannan's fear was the result of a psychotic episode, drug-induced paranoia, or a legitimate threat. But for Mari, the answer was simple. Someone chased her into that marsh, and someone left her there to die. Here's the unusual, chilling detail. When Shannan's remains were found, they were only about half a mile from where she had disappeared. All those searches, all those news crews, all the speculation, and she had been lying right there, hidden in a tangle of reeds. Locals whispered that it was as though the marsh itself had conspired to keep her hidden until it chose to let go. The discovery reignited the Gilbert family's grief. Sheree, who had always clung to a sliver of hope, was shattered. Stevie, the youngest, retreated into herself, unable to process the finality. Sarah, already fragile, descended further into instability. But Mari turned her grief into a weapon. She accused the police of incompetence, of corruption, of trying to protect the men involved. She told anyone who would listen that the drowning theory was an insult to her daughter's memory. In press interviews, Mari's voice carried a fury that burned through the static of televised news. "My daughter didn't drown. Somebody murdered her. And I will not stop until the truth comes out." The case, though, was a maze of contradictions. Shannan's autopsy was inconclusive. There were no obvious signs of strangulation or blunt force trauma. Her body had been too decomposed to determine a precise cause of death. That vagueness gave police the space to close the case quietly under the accident label, while leaving Mari and her supporters screaming into the void. Meanwhile, Shannan's name remained tethered to the larger mystery of the Long Island serial killer. Many wondered, was she the killer's 11th victim, or a tragic coincidence whose death happened in the same cursed geography? Theories multiplied, but answers remained scarce. Imagine the cinematic moment of Mari standing in the marsh herself, staring at the spot where her daughter's bones were found. The reeds swayed around her, the wind carrying the same salt and silence that Shannan had run into on that May night. Mari swore she could still hear her daughter's cries in the air. The marsh had finally given Shannan back, but in doing so, it deepened the mystery instead of solving it. The discovery of Shannan's remains should have brought closure, but instead it fractured the story into jagged pieces. For Mari Gilbert, closure was impossible without truth, and truth was still locked behind official reports that contradicted everything she believed. The Suffolk County Police doubled down on their narrative. They insisted Shannan's death was accidental. They pointed to toxicology reports hinting at possible drug use, to her history of mental health struggles, to the sheer difficulty of navigating that marsh at night. To them, the simplest explanation was that she had been overwhelmed by fear, disoriented, and lost. But Mari and her daughters weren't buying it. They looked at the timeline, the neighbors' accounts, the frantic 911 call, and the trail of bodies along Ocean Parkway. To them, it all painted a darker picture. Someone had chased Shannan into that marsh. Someone had silenced her cries. Here's a legitimate historical fact. In 2016, a medical expert hired by the Gilbert family conducted an independent autopsy on Shannan's remains. The findings suggested possible signs of strangulation, damage to the hyoid bone, a small structure in the neck often fractured during asphyxiation. Though not definitive, it added serious weight to the Gilbert family's argument. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those injuries were the result of foul play or post-mortem decomposition. What made the case even stranger was the way Shannan's story and the Long Island serial killer investigation began to blur. Many in law enforcement argued that Shannan wasn't connected, that her death was unrelated to the serial murders and isolated tragedy. But others pointed out the bizarre coincidence of geography. What are the odds, they asked, that a young sex worker would vanish in the exact area where multiple other sex workers were found? Dumped? Coincidence or connection? That question became the dividing line between skeptics and believers. For Marie, the debate wasn't academic. It was personal. She knew the world would try to dismiss Shannan the way it had dismissed so many other women in similar circumstances. She refused to let her daughter's story be diluted or forgotten. She carried photographs of Shannan everywhere, telling reporters about her laugh, her dreams, the way she could light up a room. To Marie, the fight wasn't just for justice, it was for Shannan's humanity. Here's the unusual, haunting detail: the 911 call itself, even years later, remained sealed from the public. 23 minutes of Shannan's terrified voice sat locked away in police evidence files. Mari begged for it to be released, convinced that those words would reveal everything. But the court sided with law enforcement, keeping the recording out of public ears. That secrecy fed the fire of conspiracy theories. What was in that call that authorities didn't want the world to hear? Meanwhile, the Gilbert family struggled under the relentless weight of grief. Sherry found herself taking on Mari's mission, appearing on podcasts and interviews, spreading awareness. Stevie, the youngest, tried to live quietly, though the shadow of her sister's story followed her everywhere. And Sarah, already battling demons of her own, spiraled deeper into mental instability. Mari's relentless focus on Shannan often left Sarah feeling invisible, abandoned, and increasingly volatile. The story of Shannan's death wasn't just about one woman. It began to unravel the threads of an entire family. And Mari, while fierce and tireless, carried her daughters like heavy stones, each one breaking in different ways under the pressure of tragedy. Imagine the cinematic cut: a kitchen table in Ellenville, New York. Mari sits with photographs of Shannan spread across the wood, her hand resting on her cheek, her eyes burning with exhaustion and determination. Behind her, Sarah paces in silence, her face clouded with emotions she doesn't voice. The room feels heavy, like something unseen is building toward a storm. The marsh had given Shannan back, but it hadn't given Mari peace. Instead, it had delivered her into a darker labyrinth, one where truth, lies, corruption, and grief tangled so tightly that even the brightest light couldn't find its way through. By the time 2012 turned into 2013, the case of Shannan Gilbert had drifted into a limbo of contradictions. The Suffolk County Police had all but stamped her death with the accidental drowning label, while Mari Gilbert kept pounding on doors, waving her fists at microphones, and demanding that the world look harder. But beneath the headlines and the court petitions, the Gilbert family itself was unraveling. Mari's crusade consumed her. She was everywhere: news studios, rallies, meetings with lawyers. She lived in constant battle mode, her days sharpened into a single spear point: justice for Shannan. Her daughters admired her fight, but also felt its cost. They had lost a sister, but in many ways they were also losing their mother to the obsession. For Sherry, Marie's second daughter, it became a mission too. She joined Mari at vigils and interviews, holding pictures of Shannan, telling stories that made her feel alive in the public's mind. Sherry's voice was loud, steady, and unafraid, an echo of her mother's defiance. Stevie, the youngest, tried to find normalcy, though classmates and neighbors always reminded her of her sister's ghost. Wherever she went, Shannan's name was in the air, a constant companion she hadn't chosen. And then there was Sarah. Sarah had always been the fragile one. She battled with bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, her mind a battlefield of delusions, paranoia, and rage. The strain of losing her sister and of watching Mari pour all her energy into Shannan tore open the cracks inside her. She began to resent her mother's obsession, accusing her of choosing one daughter over the others. Each argument between them grew sharper, hotter, until even family friends whispered about the danger simmering in their home. Here's a legitimate historical fact: Mari did not only fight publicly, she also waged legal battles to force the release of Shannan's 911 call, even filing lawsuits against the Suffolk County Police Department. She believed with absolute conviction that those 23 minutes would prove her daughter's murder. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether releasing the tape could jeopardize the broader Long Island serial killer case or whether it has been withheld for darker, less noble reasons. At the same time, public interest in the Lisk investigation began to stall. Tips dried up. Leads went nowhere. Police politics clouded the search, with chiefs resigning amid corruption scandals. For the Gilberts, this stall felt like betrayal. Shannan had pulled back the curtain on something horrifying, and now authorities seemed ready to draw the curtain closed again. Here's an unusual, haunting detail. Mari often claimed that Shannan came to her in dreams. In those dreams, her daughter wasn't broken or lost. She was vibrant, reaching out, urging Mari to keep going. To some, those visions were just the product of grief. To Mari, they were proof that Shannan's spirit was alive, restless, waiting for the truth. But grief is not gentle. It gnawed at Mari's household. Arguments with Sarah became frightening. Voices raised, objects thrown, doors slammed. Sarah's mental health deteriorated rapidly, her paranoia turning inward. Neighbors reported seeing her pacing outside late at night, muttering to herself. At times, she accused Mari of plotting against her. At others, she insisted voices were whispering in her ear. Cinematic cut, a dimly lit living room, Mari sitting upright in an armchair clutching a photo of Shannan. Sarah lurks in the background, her shadow stretched along the wall, her eyes burning with something unreadable. The room feels thick, as though tragedy hasn't finished with this family yet. Shannan's disappearance had already shattered the Gilbert family once. But in those years after her body was found, another storm was quietly building inside their walls, one that would soon erupt, leaving scars even deeper than the marsh had carved. By the summer of 2016, Mari Gilbert was exhausted but still relentless. Years of chasing after court dates, interviews, and petitions had carved deep lines into her face, but her voice never wavered. To anyone who would listen, she declared, "My daughter was murdered, and I will not rest until that's the official word." But inside her family, the tension was unbearable. Sarah had been spiraling for months, maybe longer. Her mental illness no longer hid in shadows, it screamed from her every gesture, every conversation. She claimed demons whispered in her ear. She accused Mari of being evil, even of being responsible for Shannan's death. The once fragile daughter now simmered with hostility, and Mari, torn between compassion and fear, struggled to keep her close. Here's a legitimate historical fact. On July 23, 2016, Mari went to visit Sarah at her apartment in Ellenville, New York. The visit ended in violence. Sarah stabbed her mother more than 200 times and struck her repeatedly with a fire extinguisher. Neighbors reported hearing terrifying screams. By the time police arrived, Mari was gone. The brutality of the act shook not just the Gilbert family, but the entire community that had watched Mari fight so tirelessly for Shannan. The irony was too cruel to process. A mother who had dedicated herself to uncovering the truth about one daughter's death was murdered by another. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Sarah's act was purely the result of untreated mental illness or whether deeper resentments fueled her rage. Some argued Sarah felt abandoned, overshadowed by the constant focus on Shannan. Others insisted that her schizophrenia had detached her from reality entirely, leaving her unable to recognize her mother as anything but a hallucinated threat. The unusual, haunting detail here: Sarah committed the murder in front of her own son. The child, barely old enough to understand, witnessed the horror and echo of generational trauma that would ripple far beyond that day. News outlets jumped on the story. Headlines screamed, "Mother of Shannan Gilbert found dead in serial killer case, murdered by daughter." It was the kind of sensational tragedy that true crime reporters salivate over, but to those who knew Mari, it felt like a cruel reduction of her life's work. She was more than her end. She was a mother who had refused to let her daughter's name be erased. Cinematic cut, flashing police lights against the windows of Sarah's apartment, officers moving cautiously through the door, the weight of disbelief heavy in the night air. Inside, chaos, the aftermath of rage, the silence of finality. For Sheree and Stevie, the news shattered what little stability they had left. In losing Mari, they lost the warrior who had carried Shannan's torch. They were forced to grieve another sudden violent death, this time inflicted by their own blood. The Gilbert family, once fractured, now lay in ruins. But even in death, Mari's mission didn't die. Her story became a symbol, a reminder of how far a mother's love can reach even when it drags her into danger. Advocates for missing women invoked her name. Documentaries etched her face into the public record. Marie had refused to be silent, and even in her absence, her voice still lingered, urging the world not to look away. And somewhere in the background, the Long Island serial killer case lingered too unsolved, untouched, like a shadow no one could escape. After Mari's murder, the Gilbert family seemed to vanish from the headlines almost overnight. The public's appetite for the gruesome details of Sarah's crime quickly gave way to silence. But for Sherry and Stevie, silence was not peace. It was another burden stacked on their shoulders. Cher, in particular, felt the torch pass directly into her hands. She became the unofficial spokesperson of the family, appearing in interviews, speaking at vigils, and demanding that the world not forget Shannan or Mari. In her voice, you could hear Mari's cadence, the same sharp conviction, the same refusal to back down. Yet there was something else to exhaustion, the kind that seeps into your bones when you've fought too long. Here's a legitimate historical fact. In December 2016, Sarah Gilbert was convicted of second-degree murder for killing her mother. At trial, her defense argued that she was severely mentally ill and incapable of understanding her actions. The jury disagreed. Sarah was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether justice in this case was served. Was Sarah a cold-blooded killer fueled by resentment, or was she a tragic victim of untreated schizophrenia, acting in the grip of psychosis? The debate continues in legal and academic circles, raising questions about how the justice system handles crimes committed by the mentally ill. What made the story even stranger was the way Marie's death reshaped the narrative of Shannan's. Instead of one unsolved mystery, the Gilbert name now carried two: the suspicious disappearance of one daughter and the brutal murder of their mother. The story was no longer just about the Long Island serial killer. It was about a family cursed by violence and tragedy. Here's an unusual, almost cinematic detail. Mari's funeral was held in the same small Hudson Valley town where Shannan's memorial had taken place years earlier. The two ceremonies blurred together in memory. The same photographs of Shannan appeared again, but now they sat beside pictures of Marie, the mother who had refused to let her vanish. Mourners spoke of Marie and Shannan almost in the same breath, as though their lives and deaths were braided into one. Meanwhile, the Lisk investigation trudged on with little progress. The police released sparse updates, offering more frustration than hope. By then, many in the true crime community had already begun to view Shannan's case as the key to understanding the entire mystery. Was she the first to stumble into the killer's hunting ground? Was she chased as Mari always believed? Or was she truly just a tragic accident, forever tangled in the wrong place at the wrong time? Sherry's frustration grew as each year passed without resolution. She often spoke of Marie's determination, how her mother had carried the fight almost single-handedly. But now the fight was Sherry's, and she didn't have Marie's unbreakable armor. She had children of her own to raise, a life to balance, and grief that kept reshaping itself into new forms. Cinematic cut: a quiet bedroom at night, Sherry scrolling through old photos of her mother and sister on her phone. The glow of the screen lights her face. Behind her, in the shadows of the room, a stack of newspapers rests in a box, each one bearing their names. The headlines may have faded, but the story still waits, restless, unfinished. The Gilbert family had been hollowed out by tragedy, but their story was still alive. It had simply shifted shape, waiting for another voice to carry it forward. And in the background, like a predator in the dark, the Long Island serial killer remained at large, silent, patient, unexposed. Years passed, but the weight of Shannan's story never lifted. The marsh where her body was found still whispered to those who visited it, a place forever linked with questions that had no clear answers. For true crime enthusiasts and grieving families alike, her name was carved into the larger mythos of the Long Island serial killer, yet her case stood apart, personal, intimate, raw. Sherry carried the fight like an inheritance. She became the one who answered journalists' questions, the one who sat across from documentarians with her hands folded and her voice steady, telling the same story again and again. Shannan didn't just vanish. Someone chased her. Someone silenced her. Her words echoed Mari's, but with a quieter edge, softened by years of sorrow. Stevie kept herself more private, but even in her silence, she carried the family's grief like an unspoken tattoo. Here's a legitimate historical fact in 2020. After years of pressure from the Gilbert family and their supporters, Suffolk County finally released portions of Shannan's 911 call. The recording revealed her panicked voice pleading with the operator, saying, "They're trying to kill me." For Mari, had she lived to hear it, that moment would have been vindication. For Sherry and Stevie, it was proof that Mari had been right all along. And yet the tape did not solve the case. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the voices in the background belonged to suspects' friends or strangers. Was Shannan truly pursued, or did her paranoia magnify the dangers of that night? The recording confirmed fear, but it did not confirm the killer. The unusual haunting detail here is this: the 911 tape was released nearly a decade after Shannan's disappearance, but her voice sounded as if no time had passed. Raw, frightened, alive. For her family, it was like being thrown back into that night in 2010, reliving the helplessness of knowing she was calling for help that never came. Cinematic cut: an empty living room, a tape recorder on the table, Shannan's voice echoing faintly through the air. The words blur, overlap, then fade into silence. Outside, the marsh rustles with the wind. The Gilbert family's story had by then stretched into something larger than one tragedy. It became a cautionary tale about how society treats sex workers, how law enforcement responds or fails to respond to vulnerable victims, and how grief can tear a family apart. Marie's fight had transformed her into an unlikely symbol, a mother who stood against institutions, against apathy, against silence. In 2023, when authorities finally announced the arrest of Rex Hoyerman, a suspect tied to multiple Lisk victims, many thought of Shannan. Was this the man connected to her death too? Or was she still separate, her fate forever lingering just outside the official record? The answer, as always, remained clouded. And that's where her story ends, not with clarity, not with closure, but with a lingering question that refuses to fade. Because in the end, the Gilbert family's story was never just about solving a crime. It was about the cost of truth, the weight of obsession, the way grief can both ignite courage and destroy everything it touches. So when you think of Shannan Gilbert, don't think only of the marsh or the missing posters or the courtroom battles. Think of a young woman chasing her own version of freedom, a mother who refused to let her name disappear, and a family forever marked by both love and tragedy. And as the night grows quiet, remember this: some stories never resolve. They echo, they haunt, they demand to be told again. The story of Shannan Gilbert may have ended with more shadows than answers, but the Long Island serial killer case continues to evolve. Just when the public began to lose hope, fresh discoveries reignited the mystery. New forensic techniques, new suspects, and even new victims brought the nightmare back into focus. And here's where it gets even more chilling. Investigators believe that the killer may have continued operating undetected for decades, adapting, changing, staying one step ahead. Some experts argue that Shannan's terrified flight into the marsh may have been the closest anyone ever came to surviving an encounter with him. Others insist her death was a tragic but unrelated event, a haunting coincidence tangled forever with the broader case. What cannot be denied is the emotional gravity Shannan's disappearance carries. It is a story of systems failing, of cries for help unanswered, of a family fighting against impossible odds. And it is also the story of resilience, how even in the face of unimaginable loss, voices like Mari's and Sherry's refuse to be silenced. So if you think the tale ends here, think again. In our next case, we'll follow another disappearance, another haunting trail that bends between the known and the unknown. A story where every clue raises new questions and every silence feels like a scream in the dark. Now let the lights dim just a little further. Let the night wrap around you. These stories don't end, they just wait for us to return.